Yeah, so this recording will be available to anybody who wants to, if you want to pass it on, or if people couldn't come tonight and they want to see it, I'll just pop it up on YouTube somewhere and send a link. So, well, I've written a book, as you now probably know, little book. Look at that. You see, you get it back to front. You've got to decipher that. It says Cairn. And this was actually thanks to coronavirus and lockdown, more or less. You know, things to do. Gather up a few poems that have been gathering a bit of dust, write some new ones, put them together, make a book. So that's what I've done. And I just plan to read a few, and I'll talk around some of the poems. I'll just invite you to sit back, to be comfortable, to listen, see where they land in you. And yeah, I don't know whether we have much conversation. Maybe we'll just open the space up at the end. So if you want to hang out and chat a bit, you're really welcome to, but that's not a pressure. Yeah, well, what do? It's unrehearsed, by the way. I've got a running order. I have no idea how Zoom reading goes on poetry, with poetry, because I've not done one before. I've taught all sorts on Zoom, but never done poetry. So, yeah, just to say, quite a few of you know me in other ways. You know, I know some of you through Qigong or other parts of my world, or nutrition, or as friends, and this is me showing up as poet. So this is the part of me I'd like to share. And the first poem is an invitation to you. It's an invitation to be here and now and present. And it's called Here and Now. The life we refuse will breach our defenses anyway, even at the moment of death. Don't wait that long. In every moment there is a door with a sign saying now, waiting to be opened. Don't hesitate, don't even knock. Even when we turn away, we will arrive again at this same door. Every step we take is toward this door. The life we refuse is singing to us from the other side. Step through. The old life, with its comforting certainties, is not a home for the soul. Break the furniture, run at the door, and leap into the place they call here. It's a bit of here and now. And that was a bit of Rumi going on, I think, for me. For those of you familiar with Rumi, big influence on me. And I think a little bit of Rumi got channeled in that little invitation to you. So my poetry arises from my life, I suppose, like most of us, and most of us who write, but also in particular from my relationship with the natural world, and often from walking, and often from Dartmoor. I live between Dartmoor and the sea, so quite a few poems arise somehow or other on Dartmoor, or they arise down on the coast, on the south coast of Devon. And so some of these have those locations. So this arose when I was going for a walk with my friend Stuart, who's a painter who I did my first book with. He was the painter, for those of you who know it, he paints Dartmoor and the south coast. And I find that walking's really good. I find that walking is a way of moving something through in myself, and often it's a source of inspiration, and often it walks me into, I walk into in some way a poem. They often arrive that way, and then I come back and there's something hopefully that I can scribble down before I lose it, and probably 9 out of 10 get lost, but sometimes I come back and there's something to write down. And like every walk or every journey, it feels like it has a mythical layer, a mythical level to it, or it's not just the walk we're going on, but it's an archetypal experience going for a walk, and this is true here really. This is walking down to the River Dart. It's called The Necessary Descent. Invisible from the road, the land folds into a valley of tumbled granite. We step down through twisting chambers of oak, erupting from moss-swathed boulders, through deepening vocabularies of green, toward the sound of the river. The signals from the world we are leaving flit above the canopy. This is the necessary descent. This is the necessary descent. Unless we go down through the moist creases of earth to touch the river and know again the source of our own aliveness, unless we go down again and again to drink at the cold water, this unquenched thirst will burn in our throats at the dry moment of our death. This unquenched thirst will burn in our throats at the dry moment of our death. No danger of that, though. I've got a glass of wine. So I move a lot between, apart from the local woods here where I go a lot, I move between here and the south coast. And this next poem, I should say, by the way, I've chosen about somewhere between 12 and 15 poems for the evening, because I feel like I know what it's like. Well, if I go into a gallery, for example, I can't take it all in. I have to just choose a few, and that's really enough. So I don't want to saturate with too many poems, but also to give enough so that you have some, have an evening. So I'm imagining this will take an hour and possibly a little bit less. That's my intention. So here I was staying in some Coast Guard cottages down at East Poole, one of my favourite places. And it was like a little writing retreat for me. I had a few days and of course was walking every day and spent a lot of time looking out to the sea with nothing on my mind particularly, just gazing. And sometimes a poem will arise. In fact, these next two poems kind of arose through gazing out at sea. Two different poems arose. And the first one, in a way, is like how what feels like a kind of ordinary day can suddenly break open into something transformative in an unexpected kind of way. It's called Light on the Horizon. We woke to fierce winds hurling spray toward the window, a sky heaving with cloud, clambering out of the south, dragging its tails in the sea and trawling far inland. At the land's edge, I watched the waves unravelling against the rocks, the cold moil and sweat of the waters churning in crevices, the spume lifted high on the wind. A wild day, and I have come down to stand in its open jaw. Out beyond the turmoil, I watch for whatever weather is rising, beyond where sea and sky struggle to separate. There is no telling. Nor could it have been told that the clouds would crack just enough as they did, splaying columns of sunlight in an immense fan far out at sea, a thin bar of light igniting along the horizon, and the distant waters burning, as if I stood in another time, witness to the miraculous birth of fire at the edge of the visible world. I want to tell of this in words ripped from my mouth by the crazed wind, carrying the news to other lives equally in need of saving. Now, I've just realized in my incredible excitement about seeing all these lovely faces, that's you, that probably this is also what's being recorded. So I might have to abandon that, because I suspect if people want to watch the recording, they probably won't want to be peering at little boxes to see who's who, or let alone to find me. So I'm just going to pin myself, and that will probably change it. for you. Changes it for me, for sure. Okay. So the second poem, from the sea. Again, it was another day, walking and sitting and looking out at sea. And often I find with poems, there's more than one thing happening at the same time in me. So there can be what's happening kind of immediately around me, like being on the cliffs looking out at sea and what there is there and my responses to that. And then quite often there'll be something else I'm kind of carrying. And in this particular case, I've been thinking a lot about what was happening out at Standing Rock in the States, where the first people were protesting against a pipeline across their lands. And it was a big standoff, and I felt very moved by it. And so somehow or other, my little experience on the south coast of Devon in Little England seemed to bridge the Atlantic to what was happening over there. So these two came together. This is the poem of those two things coming together, and it's called Earth Drum. I don't know if some of you might know the area. It's old. You can kind of feel the evidence of all the old occupation and how the fields were thousands of years ago. And there are these ridiculous walls, made out of granite that have been dragged out of the field, but some of them just kind of plunge in like an almost, not quite perpendicular, but almost perpendicular line down the side of the cliff. And you look at it and you think, why would they bother with that? But they did, and they're there. Anyway, I say that because there's a reference to them in here. Along these cliffs, they too looked out on the ceaseless motion of the sea. Ancestors we never knew, who hauled from the ground the heavy rocks now piled as walls, or planted upright to make the toothed boundary lunging precariously down the steep headland. Their round huts porous to the incessant breath of the sea and prying winds, speaking to me now through my feet as I walk in their vanishing footprints. 100 times I have walked here and still a visitor. It would take a lifetime of bowing to this land in all its seasons, before the buzzard, seen today hovering keenly on the wind's edge, accepts me as cousin. Yet I know I love this place. Here I have exchanged vows with the wild shore and the crazed headlands and the rolling fields. A pact of love that brings me back again and again, as it has today. I gaze out beyond the arced rib of the horizon. Across the water at Standing Rock, the nations of the first people rise again, the beat of the earth's drum calling them toward the cannons of the new cavalry. Sacred ground, in all our bones sleeps a warrior who has never abandoned the earth. I don't know if love is enough. I don't know if love is enough. The riptide of despair can pull us far from the shore, pulls me now toward its loveless drowning. Going down to the pebble beach, I close my eyes, my back to the rocks, my face bathed in the pale warmth of the winter sun. I feel the dread of the monstrous force rising in the west. I do not know whether loving this world is enough to save it. But I do know that whatever we do not love enough, we will lose. which kind of moves me on. The price of loving the world really is also to suffer and to grieve. Can't escape it. And now, the times we live in now, which are so difficult, having to face up to the extinction of species and an unimaginable future in generations' time for the people who live on this earth and all the creatures who live on this earth. It's hard times. It's hard times to be in, and I get really caught up in grief a lot of the time. Sometimes paralyzed by the grief, to a point where I can't really act usefully. Sometimes I get over that by getting active in some activist kind of way. Sometimes I get through it by writing a poem like this one, and I think talking and then sharing. There are other ways, but just to acknowledge the volume of grief that that's there. However much we want to open to it, it's kind of there waiting for us all the time. And this poem is about extinction, and there was a ceremony in Totnes, or just outside, started by a friend of mine called Azul, and the idea was people would bring a stone or a rock and build a cairn, which is the title of the book. They would build a cairn, and each stone represented a lost species. And it was a ceremony. I never got to go to it, but I was really inspired by it. It kind of stayed as a very powerful image for me. So I wrote a poem based on that, called Cairn. We tried at first to understand by numbers, thinking how simple it would be. But the numbers span us round, giddy, unable to hold our centre, as if they held a compact force that repelled any approach. And so we turned to names and spoke them at the speed of their leaving. Spix's macaw, eastern cougar, Baiji dolphin, Pyrenean ibex, western black rhino, Zanzibar leopard, Eskimo curlew, cry violet, and on until our grief choked us. In the end, we turned to piling stones, a speechless meditation on extinction. A long line of us, day after day, the cairn growing impossibly, towering now above our fragile homes. If you listen, you will hear it. The clack of stone upon stone, soundtrack to our days and nights. Full stops at the end of million-year lines. So, warning. Quite a lot of my poems are about grief in some way, and there are ways for me of processing it, I think. But also, hopefully, I guess my hope for poetry is that, if you write a poem that's about a grief that, is a grief that we can all touch, that it serves also, it's something that supports us to feel more, to grieve, and to move it, and not to be overwhelmed by it all the time. So, this one, this one's called Badger. This one's called Badger. And I think for lots of people probably haven't seen a live badger, actually. They've almost certainly seen a dead one on the road. And that's what this is about a dead badger. And it's about, doesn't need an introduction, you'll see. Crow ups from the splattered brains of badger steam pressed into tarmac. Not long ago, shouldering myopic through the intimate darkness, toward this violent end in a howl of light. No more the snouting clan trails through the shining scent-pierced night. No more the claw-ripped bark, glanded signpost to the grubbing fields. No more the sharp stench of vole amongst the snuffling tussocks, the soft crunch of snail in the mouth and moon-bathing worms in the feasting meadows. Our onward, headlit rush toward far destinations crosses a darker and slower geography, invisible until this sudden collision of worlds. My son asks only why the badger crossed the road, like some dark joke. She didn't, I reply. We crossed hers. So this next poem, need one of those. This next poem's got a little bit of history, which I'll tell you. I sometimes wonder, why do I write poetry? You know, is it just an indulgence, or what does it serve? All these sort of self-questioning, ridiculous doubts that we all have about what we do with our lives. I have that about poetry, and following this theme of loving the earth and how do we respond to what is happening, to climate change, biodiversity loss. How do we respond? And so I went through a phase. I've had various phases in my life, actually, but a few years ago, a phase with Extinction Rebellion, up in London a couple of times, got more front line with the action. Seemed like a thing to do. And going up there, I was thinking just before I went, like, what do I bring? What can I bring? I could, I'm a number amongst many. That's good. And I thought, I can bring poetry. And I'd written around that time a poem, which actually started in a pub, not on some walk in nature, but in a pub with a pint of beer. And I bumped into some friends of mine in the pub, and they were looking quite animated, I thought, and quite happy. So I asked them where they'd been, and they said, "Oh, we've just been to this workshop. It was called How to Be a Good Ancestor." And I thought, I wrote the line down on my phone, and that's how the poem got seeded. Anyway, so it's called The Good Ancestor, and I took it up to London. What I did was I printed 300 copies on sort of A5 size, I think, and took them with me in my bag. And my mission was to give poems directly to people along the lines of, would you like a poem? And then if there was a response, I had to have, my little rule for myself was I needed like a line of conversation, and then I could give the poem. I couldn't just randomly, like leaflets, kind of pass them out. And it was a great process. I didn't get through them all, so I gave some to others to give away. And couldn't quite manage it. I didn't realize how long it would take. It's like 2 or 3 hours every day, really, doing that. Anyway, it was still quite rewarding. And I read this poem we were on Waterloo Bridge. And I read it on Waterloo Bridge, and I think it got read in Trafalgar Square. And I kept getting these stories coming back about the poem and where it had been, and people had been arrested with it in their pockets, and they'd read it out as their statement, or when they were arrested. And I heard stories of someone reading it and a policeman crying. And one day I came back in the morning, and I found someone had chalked my poem all the way down the central aisle, whatever you call it, that separates the 2 roads on the bridge. I chalked it in big all the way down, like 50 yards long or something. And I didn't know what it was at first, And then I realized it was my poem, and someone had really beautifully, with colored chalks, written the thing on the middle of the road, and people were standing around reading it. So anyway, I think what I got from that is that in terms of political action, a poem can also serve, just as a good song can serve, to support the energy of any kind of movement. So I feel like this poem did that for some time, and has gone around a bit. I hear of it being read in different places, so it's still kind of doing its work, and I'm glad of that. So I'm going to read it to you, and it can do its work with you, and you can pass it on, or you can read it at some moment where you feel such a thing needs to be read. And I guess what I hope for these poems really is that they're for sharing. The poems are things we take to a circle around a fire, or a course that we're on, or something where we just think, you know what, I've got a poem, and it gets brought in that way. So that's what I'd like. So this one, called The Good Ancestor. Every day I walk 100 years to the hill where my great-great-granddaughter sits. I carry words of blessing and reach to touch her back. But feeling me near, she turns, sad-eyed and heavy with grief. What was it like, she asks, when the great whales swam? When the birds sang you awake? When the rains came soft and the soil smelled sweet underfoot, and the blessings catch in my throat? On darker days, she turns, her famished face charred and eyes sunk in their bony orbits burn with curses. And the blessings froth at my mouth with the poisonous spume of betrayal. On the darkest of all days, I walk the 100 years and find no one there. Let today be the bright day. Let today be the bright day. I lay my hand upon her back, and feeling me there, she turns and blesses me, saying, your love was fierce enough, sweet ancestor. Your love was fierce enough. Book of poetry has just come out. An Extinction Rebellion book of poetry, and I submitted this and it got put in, and I was really glad to see, and in a way surprised to see it, but given how miserable I feel sometimes, that it was put in the section called Hope. So apparently that's a hopeful poem. I'm glad of that. Cheers. There was a book called This Changes Everything. Just kind of forgotten what her name was who wrote it. Great book about climate change, and just when we face it, we have to change. It's like everything changes. When we face it, everything changes, and our whole life gets reconsidered, both individually and as a whole society. So I was thinking about this. It's a great book. I can't remember her name. Anyway, but I started thinking about this in another way, like around how we respond to diagnosis. This poem's called Diagnosis, and the IPCC report or whatever it is that we look at is a diagnosis, and it's terminal, unless we do something. It's clear the way that it's heading. And so I started thinking about that sort of news and how we receive it, more in our lives if we're diagnosed with cancer or something that changes our lives. There are those moments many of us have had that our life is sort of turned around by one piece of news, maybe delivered by a doctor. So I'm just reflecting on that, although ultimately it's about the same thing of how we reply, how we respond. How do we respond to the climate and what's happening? I've seen them turn toward life. I've seen them turn toward life. Those the doctor sentences to death, their diagnosis beyond doubt, cancer's image irrefutable. I've seen them turn to those they love, finally open to cherishing and being cherished. Stubborn refusals, dissolving at last into belonging. I've seen them turn away from all that harms the ground on which they stand, the body in which they live. Extend the span of the one life they have finally come to love. I've seen them open to joy. I've seen them stop their hungry gnawing at the world, to breathe the sea air, to touch the tree, to bow before the flower, turning towards something more eloquent and simple. I've seen them smile at the incandescent and irresistible beauty of the world, speaking of love and its necessity. Some arriving as they leave, others turning the disease around and entering a more passionate and grateful life. I've seen those two who refuse the invitation. The news that changes everything is no longer whispered but shouted across the earth. Now that we know beyond doubt the dying that we face, what will we do? I ask again, what will we do? Change of mood. When I was originally going to write I was trying to write a poetry book, around those themes really of basically of responses to, well, especially the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. But it's a huge picture, hard to give it labels really. But I had to respond to that. But there were other themes in my life, and there's other things that I wanted to push through, and so there's a few. When I came to put the book together, I thought, how on earth do these poems hang together? But they kind of fell into 5 or 6 quite clear themes, and I'm going to switch theme. And one of the themes was love and relationships and sex. So I thought I'd read maybe 3 poems around that: love, lust, and sex, relationship. The first one's called A Beginning. So I think it's quite hard to know where a relationship begins, really. You might have your kind of anniversary of where it begins, and obviously that's not usually where it started. Something before, and then something before that, and so this poem is about actually just tracking that further and further back and musing about where it really began. This particular relationship, in theory, was triggered by an email. How's that for modern? But in fact, of course, there was more going on before that. The beginning there was, for sure. Your message, a beginning of rising, a kindling. And earlier beginnings, I remember now, stood still, watching you across the grass, something uncoiling inside. Or the hug I asked of you, unable to stop myself, feeling already the tumbling toward you. Or the way I came to see your new path, only to be closer to you. Beginnings inside beginnings. And the true beginning elsewhere, before we met, before you were born, perhaps beyond the wombs of both our beginnings. So there's beginnings, and then if you're lucky, there's the kind of tumbling into wild lovership for a while. And this one is a wild lovership kind of poem. I better have a glass of wine before this. This is one of those other poems where 2 things kind of converged. Not just 2 people converging, but it was actually Radio 4. I've been listening to Radio 4 about the Buick Swans and their migration from, I think from Russia. And I didn't even know that they migrated here. I thought they were resident. I think some are, but some migrate. And anyway, it stayed with me, and the image of the swans was kind of in me for quite a long time. And so they merge, and the swan merges into this poem. And it's called Night Swan. We are newly lovers, and the long night is full of the smell of skin and roses. We have travelled far for this, across the years of loving, of not loving, to this bright bed, these fat candles, and the cold moonlight lapping at the window. The night around us is so wide. I can hear far beyond the lake the beat of the white swan's wings in the luminous darkness, its neck outstretched like a bar of light, its red pulsing heart wrapped in whiteness as it journeys home across the harsh tundra and bitter seas. Meanwhile, we ride the long wet night of our desire, learning each other's bodies and our own anew, travelling the silken channels of our flesh towards each other. Until in the wild darkness my wave breaks upon your shore, breaks upon the new shore of your body, and I am tumbling like the swan into the waiting waters, delivered unexpectedly into innocence, into a bright and lucid silence. For a moment bewildered, I search your face for answers. I don't know where they come from, these salt tears. It is as if you had spoken the echo of my own longing, as if the swan had been called all those thousands of miles by its own reflection in the dark water, as if I have been migrating towards you all my life. So you have that bit, if all goes well in the relationship. And then you have the mundane, and maybe you have the mundane all the way through, but there's a lot of the mundane in relationship. I need to find this one. Where's it disappeared to? You know, where the cherishing really is of the ordinary, simple things. There it is. So I find that some love poems actually get made up of, or get made out of, something quite humdrum or simple. And this one's called Coming Home. She is asleep upstairs, has left on the hall light, a love token. The imprint of her love still on the light switch, the scent of it in the air of the stairwell. The house breathes with her, as if under a spell. I climb the stairs to stroke her bare shoulder, rousing her slightly, then soothing her back to sleep. She's laid new sheets on the bed. Whatever hardness gripped my heart today is melting. Two more, I think, and then I feel like it's sufficient. And these two are from the tail end of the book. And the book arrives at death. You know, as you get older, you go to more funerals than weddings, that's for sure. And you know, you kind of get dismantled by death and the wonder of it, and the confusion of it, and you know, what to make of it and how to be with it. And you know, really, for me, being in this place where I don't really have any answers to that, just more like kind of intimations of something beyond, perhaps, or not. Anyway, these two poems are kind of musings on death, quite short. Migration. Sometimes I think it must be like this, the migration of souls. The way geese come over the visible horizon, honking with delight and recognition, and how they leave, long necks outstretched toward a future we cannot see. Sometimes I think it must be like this, a brief exuberance between arrival and departure, wings that know the way we are blind to. And lastly, it feels appropriate to end with death. I haven't got a kind of happy poem to end on, but these are not necessarily unhappy poems either. They're just about ending. So this last one is a true story. When I was born, I was born in a hospital, 5:30 in the morning, and my mother tells me a blackbird for the whole time of that last part of her labour at dawn was sitting on the windowsill and singing the whole way through, and that story has really stayed with me. And what I notice in life, you know, there's probably for all of us, like certain animals, we get drawn to. And for me, it's that one of them is the blackbird. I see the blackbird. I kind of know where it is instinctively and hear it. And if I hear something kind of scratching around in the leaves, I know that's a blackbird, and we catch each other. So somehow or other, I feel like they're companions for me. I feel an affinity, I guess. So this is a poem about a blackbird, or blackbirds as companions, and it's called Companion. After the long night of my mother's labour, a blackbird sang from the windowsill at the dawn of my birth. Along the way now they are companions, bright-eyed fossicas in leaf litter, singers after rain. A pair nest each year in the bay tree close by the house, and migrants come in winter to peck at the fallen apples I leave for them. All my life we have paid attention to one another, familiars on our journeys between worlds. One day, perhaps, just as he sang me in, the blackbird will sing me back into the speckled silence of another night. There we go. I think that's enough. Probably poetry saturation, I should think. It's as many as I can handle. I hope that's been a nice way to spend the evening. I'm going to come back in a minute into the gallery and just hang out if you like a little bit. So if you want to buy a copy of the book or more, of course, just email me. I will have emailed you, so you've got my email address. Or if you haven't, post@meridianpress.net. If you're not sure, I'll put it into the chat. And just make sure you give me your land address. About half the people who ask for a book don't give me their land address, so I can't do it. So send me your land address. I'll then send you the book and tell you how to pay, but don't pay until it arrives, and it's arrived safely, and then do it then. That's the deal. Okay, thanks a lot, and let's come back to the